was another ordinary night in the quiet neighborhood where Sarah lived with her parents. A 17-year-old girl was used to the routine of being alone at home when her parents were away, something that happened occasionally. She even liked the feeling of independence, although the house always seemed a little more empty and silent in those moments. His dog, Max, a golden retriever always attentive and caring, was his only company. He follows Sarah around the house as a faithful bodyguard. That night, she was playing on the sofa in the living room, zappando the TV channels while Max slept next to her. Outside, the wind shook the trees in the yard, and the sound of the dried leaves crawling along the sidewalk was muffled by the news murmurs that she barely paid attention to. Everything seemed so banal until the words "serial killer" and "neighborhood" echoed on the screen. Sarah froze. She dropped the remote, eyes fixed on the reporter's serious face, which detailed the latest events. A wanted murderer was last seen in a nearby neighborhood, described as extremely dangerous. Max declared his head, perhaps capturing the change in his mistress' mood. Sarah swallowed it dry. She tried to convince herself that there was no reason for panic. The door was locked, as were the windows. Or were you? Suddenly the silence of the house began to seem oppressive, and the idea of being completely alone struck her like a cold wave. The sense of security that she had before evaporated as soon as the news took root in her mind. Locked, she repeated to herself. The door was locked. The windows were locked. She needs to be sure. Max, let's go. The dog beats her close up as she walks around the house, starting with the front door. He checked the latch, pulling the handle to make sure it was firm. Then he went into the kitchen where the windows looked out onto the dark backyard. Sarah removed the curtain and stared at the glass for a moment, her eyes fixating on her own reflection, as if she expected to see something or someone from the other side. Nothing. Only the darkness. Passed to the dining room, the bathroom, the parents' room. In each room, checking the window latches with trembling hands, trying to control the growing panic that seemed to squeeze his chest. When you got to your room, I felt a little breakdown. Everything was safe. She looked at Max, who had settled down by the side of the bed, as if he was as vigilant as she. He seemed calm, which should be a good sign. But then the bell rang. Sarah has frozen. For a moment, his whole body decided to move. It was impossible. It couldn't be. Maybe they're my parents. She murmured to herself, but the idea doesn't make sense. They always warn before they arrive. He took his phone to check messages, but there was nothing. Max growled softly, looking at the bedroom door. "Stay here, Max," she whispered in a shaky voice. He descended the stairs slowly, the steps creaking under his feet. Each sound seemed amplified in silence. When he arrived at the front door, he stood on his toes to spy through the peephole. Nobody. Sarah's heart was beating so fast that she could hear it in her ears. The light from the porch illuminated the entrance to the house, but there was no sign of movement, nor shadow. She unlocked the door slowly and opened a crack, just enough to confirm that her eyes had already seen. No one was there. With a knot in his throat, he closed the door again and turned the lock with a firm click. She hastened back to her room, where Max was still sitting with eyes on the door. Throwing yourself in bed, control the trembling in your hands. It was just a joke, Maybe some kid from the neighborhood came up, although I didn't really believe that. But before you could laugh, I heard a sound. A muffled noise. Coming from inside the house. The sound was low, but unmistakable. It seemed like a step. Or maybe something dragging on the ground. Sarah felt her throat tight, looked at Max, hoping he would calm her down somehow, but the dog was still, with his ears raised, looking at the door as if he had heard too. "It must be my imagination," she whispered, almost inaudible. But I knew it wasn't. What came again? This time, higher. Something was moving downstairs. Sarah opened her phone in her hands, struggling to think about what to do. The police. Of course, I must call the police. With trembling fingers, she opened the call app but stopped before opening the button. And not for nothing. What if I'm so paranoid? She didn't want to be the one who called the police because of a creak on the floor. But then another sound came. A clap, like a door being opened. Max began to growl, low and continuous, the hair of the neck bristled. Sarah spoke slowly, trying to control the panic that threatened to contact her. His eyes ran across the room, looking for something he could use as a weapon. The only thing I found was the lamp next to the bed. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. She moved from the door of the room and leaned her ear. Everything was quiet again, the kind of silence that does not calm but suffocates. Breathing deeply, opened the door only a crack, enough to spy on the corridor. The dim light of the lamp in the room illuminated part of the staircase, but the rest of the house was plunged into darkness. "Is anyone there?" His voice came out louder than expected, but it shook so much that it looked like a leaf in the wind. No response. Max passed in front of her, walked slowly out of the room. He went down one step on the ladder, then another, his body tense and his head lowered. Sarah felt the security impulse, but was petrified. The noise came back. This time, clearer. Steps. And up the stairs. Sarah retreated into the room, quickly closing the door and locking it. Pressed the body against the wood, holding the handle as if it was enough to stop who or what was out there. Max growled loud now, his paws scratching the ground as he stood facing the door, prepared to protect his mistress. The steps stopped on the other side. And then, 3 soft knocks on the door. Sarah felt the tears burst out of her eyes. She wanted to scream, but her voice didn't come out. Silence returned, but this time it seemed more threatening than ever. The handle started to turn slowly. Sarah held the doorknob with all the strength she had, her hands sweating and heart beating so loud that it seemed to echo through the room. "Go away," she spoke finally, the broken voice shared of despair. On the other side, silence was absolute. The sound of the turning handle stopped. For a moment she thought it was over. Maybe whoever gave up. But then something even worse happened. A scratch on it. It was not a normal scratch, like that of nails or claws. It was deliberate, dragged, as if something was being slowly rubbed against the wood of the door. What you ran through is like a knife cutting your already fragile self-control. Max started barking wildly, advancing against the door, while Sarah retreated to the corner of the room, clinging to the lamp. The scratch stopped. And then, a voice. "Sarah. Read more." She froze. It wasn't a loud voice, but it was clear enough to go through the door and nail her mind. It was a strangely calm voice, almost soft, but loaded with something that made her skin shiver. I know you're in there." She could not speak, could not move. Everything in her body screamed to run, but there was nowhere to go. Max stopped barking. He still stared at the door, but now with a low, almost imperceptible growl. "Why don't you open the door, Sarah? I want to see you." Tears ran down her face, but her mind worked frantically. Whoever it was knew his name. This made sure it was not a random stranger. But she did not recognize the voice. Without warning, something hit the door hard, making it shake in its fittings. Sarah said, holding the lamp with both hands as if it were a shield. Max started barking again, louder and fiercer than before. Another blow. And another. The door was ceding. Sarah looked desperately at the room, trying to think of something, anything she could do. Her eyes landed on the window. She ran up there and opened it in a hurry, the cold night air invading the room. She looked down and it was a high fall. "Max, come," Sarah whispered urgently, trying to call the dog. But Max doesn't move. He kept looking at the door, now completely motionless, growling low. Sarah realized that he was protecting her, refusing to leave while the danger was still there. "Max, please." She tried again, but before she could insist, another violent blow struck the door, and this time she caught the sound of cracking wood. Without more time to think, Sarah ran her legs through the window frame and began to descend gently, holding onto the ledge. The cold of metal against her hands only increased the panic that consumed her. Her heart pounded on her chest as she looked down. It was scary, but no more than what was behind that door. She broke loose, falling on her back in the bed. The pain shot up in her spine, but it was not serious. Quickly, she declared herself, looking up, hoping to see Max following her. But the sound coming from the window froze his blood. "Sarah. Read more." The voice was now closer, much closer. She didn't know how it was possible, but the provocative and almost mocking tone seemed right next to her. Sarah ran. Barefoot and disoriented, she crossed the yard, ignoring the branches that scratched her skin. Every sound seemed amplified, his feet against the ground, his accelerated breathing, the wind in the bushes. His only hope was to reach the house of some neighbor and ask for help. Behind her, the sound of the room door finally being knocked down echoed in the night. Max started barking again, but this time the sound sounded more distant as she advanced desperately through Gramadoo. The nearest neighbors were only a few houses away. The light of one's balcony was on, a small island of safety amid terror. Sarah ran towards the house, shouting, "Help! Please, someone help me!" But before she could reach the balcony, she tripped, falling to the ground with force. The impact made her lose her breath, but when she tried to get up, something stopped her. There was a shadow. In front of him, on the grass lit by the light from the balcony, was someone. It was a tall figure, immobile, with the head slightly tilted as if studying. Sarah could not see her face, but the outline was unmistakable, a presence that seemed to grow in the heavy air around her. Before I could react, the figure stepped forward, and Sarah finally saw the reflection of something shiny in his hand. A knife. Sarah backed even further, the air weighing in her lungs, her tremendous legs as if sacred to give way. The knife shone in the light of the porch, reflecting the intensity of his fear. Every second seemed to stretch, as if time had slowed down, forcing her to face the threat with a clearly terrifying. "You won't run away, Sarah," the figure said, his voice full of a cold confidence. He took another step towards her, the gentle but heavy steps, as if he knew she had nowhere to go. Sarah felt the panic reach a peak that seemed unbearable. "I can't think straight, just react," moving like an instinct. She tried to get up, but her knees failed and she fell again, eyes now fixed on the blade of the knife, which seemed to shine with the promise of something much worse. "Please, please don't." She begged, the voice failed, but the man didn't answer. "He just keeps moving slowly. His body writhed in an attempt to escape, but then there was a burst of movement. Max. The dog appeared out of nowhere, jumping hard towards the figure. He came forward as a furious, open-mouthed Latino with an anger that Sarah had never heard of before. He attacked the figure with an unexpected impulse, catching the man unprepared and making him fall to the ground with force. Max. Sarah spoke, now trying desperately to get up. The dog kept attacking the man, but the figure moved, pulling the knife and pushing Max to the side with a quick blow. Sarah saw the scene with her eyes wide open, adrenaline taking over her body. She needs to act. With a superhuman effort, she spoke again, running towards the man. In an irrational impulse, she grabbed what she could, a piece of branch that fell to the ground, and hit as hard as she could on the attacker's head. The man spoke, staggeringly back, and it was enough for Max to go on the offensive. He advanced again, biting the attacker in the leg, forcing him to fall to the ground once and for all, while Sarah, with tears in her eyes, tried to prevent the worst. The figure was down, but still breathing. She didn't know what to do. Fear was mixed with a frantic impulse to survive, but she didn't know how far her own fear could take her. It was at this moment that the light of the neighbor's house lit up even more, and the door opened. "Hey! What's going on here?" A specific male voice. Sarah needed nothing else. Help was finally there. She fell to her knees on the ground, completely exhausted, while Max still snarled, but stood by her as if she knew that danger had gone away, even for a brief moment. The neighbor ran towards them, pushing the attacker away from Sarah. "I've already called the police." Max was panting, but with a watchful eye, keeping a guard position next to his mistress. Sarah, with her heart racing, tried to recover, but all she could think was that even with that seemingly finished nightmare, the terror was still in her body. She knew that she would never be the same again. "Are you okay?" one of the officers asked, in a soft voice, trying to calm her down. Sarah just agreed but couldn't say a word. What could I say? The feeling of being watched, of being pursued by an unknown person who seemed to know everything about her, that was not something I could simply erase. Max was next to her, his behavior did not stop for a second. He still looked at the fallen man with suspicion, growling low as if he was ready to jump again, should it be necessary. "He's one of the wanted," the police officer commented to another officer, who was writing something down on a clipboard. Sarah looked at him, confused. "But, he..." Sarah swallowed it dry. "He was there in my house. He knew my name." The policeman looked at her with an expression that mixed surprise and concern. "This is more serious than we thought. He should have followed you closely." Sarah felt a chill running through her spine. If he was watching her, it required him to know where she lived. He probably knew the exact moment when his parents left. The feeling of being observed, as if every movement he knew was before it even happened, took over his mind, like a shadow that is difficult to fend off. "You're safe now," the policeman said, trying to comfort her. But Sarah wasn't sure about that. Nothing seemed safe. The man was taken handcuffed to the car, his expression unexpressive, but his eyes were fixed on it, as if all had been part of some macabre game. Sarah knew, deep down, that this chapter had not yet been foreseen. He could be trapped now, but the feeling of being watched, of being the target of something greater, would not abandon him so easily. While the officers finished recording the details and checking the scene, one of the neighbors came to Sarah, worried. "Are you okay? We want to help in some way." Sarah looked at him, and for the first time that night, her eyes filled with tears. I don't know what to do. I don't know what happened. I just want it to end. But I knew it wasn't that simple. The man at your door was not a simple psychopath. He had made a point of infiltrating his life, of being present in the shadows. And Sarah was afraid that he was still out there somewhere, waiting for the right time to return. She looked at Max, who now approached calmly, breathing breathlessly but calmly, as if knowing that everything that could be done was already done. He would protect her, and she knew that he would do the same if necessary. But how about her? Fear was still there, in every shadow, in every corner. Something in Sarah will change forever. She would never look at her home, her neighborhood, her life, the same way. And then, one last question hovered in his mind, almost a terrifying whisper. He was alone.